Alright, so we're back, of course, to talk about some more Square Enix, and we recently got an annual report from Square Enix for 2022, and I don't think we've ever looked at one of these before, because we've looked at a lot of their fiscal year related stuff, right? Usually their financial reports for those, for like the first quarter, first half, stuff like that, the first 3/4. So I'm not entirely sure what this is, just because I don't think we've ever covered one before, because when it comes to like their fiscal year, for example, that ends on March 31st and begins on April 1st, right? So we're obviously still several months away from this ending, almost half a year actually. And obviously, in terms of like an annual report, the year itself isn't over yet. So I don't know what this is. I don't know if we ever covered one of these. That being said, though, just looking through it, it is very, very similar to a financial report. It's pretty much the exact same thing, I would say. I didn't read it all like we usually do with financial reports. Those are usually broken down a little bit easier. There's like 40 pages of this damn thing, so there's a lot more to it than what I think we usually look at. And also, we're not really going to cover this in the way that we do financial reports, just because those, at least for the past couple of years, have usually pertained to Remake, and Remake is mentioned in this, but it's more so just because Remake came to PC, obviously, at the end of last year, and Steam, like, was a couple months ago or some shit, handful of months aago. So it's not really Remake-centric, FF7-centric here, so it's not really something we need to really read. And it kind of goes without saying at this point just because how big the game is, but it's still worth mentioning that Final Fantasy XIV was yet again another big contributor to their financial success this year. Which isn't really surprised because it was the same thing last year, because like 2021 there wasn't really any like major releases, at least on par with like the Remake release in 2020, right? We had like a new Life is Strange last year, and like despite Square Enix not being satisfied with it, we had Guardians of the Galaxy come out last year, which the community seems to like, the fan base seemed to like, but not Square Enix. And then this year's kind of the same too. We had some decent releases. Stranger of Paradise went over pretty well, but again, there wasn't that major release on par with like something like Forspoken that we're waiting for, the next Dragon Quest game, Dragon Quest 12, or like 16, or obviously Rebirth or something, right? There's no major releases on par with those kind of games right now. But even if we did have a major release, it's hard to say whether or not that game would make as much or more money than what Final Fantasy XIV is making right now. I mean, it was so popular earlier this year whenever Endwalker came out that they literally had to stop selling copies of the game so people could fucking play it. I do think next year's financial reports will be pretty interesting because we're going to have multiple major releases with like Forspoken and obviously Final Fantasy 16, both insanely hyped games, and potentially Rebirth, depending on how they want to do the next winter thing, right? Because that could extend into 2024. But obviously next year, Final Fantasy 14 is also going to make a shit ton of money again, so it'll be interesting to see how those major titles stack up against that game. And we're just making a whole little segment here about 14 apparently. But Rebirth should be within the next fiscal year just because, you know, next winter is going to be like December to March. And obviously their fiscal year ends in March. So unless there's any delays, you will have 16 and Rebirth in the same fiscal year. So next year should be very, very financially successful for them. And because Forspoken is, at least as of right now, still coming out in January of 2023, barring any delays, that'll make it a part of this current fiscal year. So as successful as it already is, depending on how big this launch is, it could be way more. So there's two kind of major talking points I've seen coming out of this end report. One of them being that they do show and kind of talk about or display Ever Crisis in the end report and kind of the upcoming like Final Fantasy games in general. But there's noticeably a lack of a release date or window, which has a lot of people believing that Ever Crisis is not dropping this year, which I think is honestly kind of a safe bet at this point. I don't think it's necessarily proof of anything just because there's still about exactly 2 months at this point, I guess, until the year ends, and they could honestly tomorrow drop a trailer for Ever Crisis, and it could still release within this year, right? Because it's a mobile game. It's already had like a year or two of marketing. It's been out there, not like full on marketing, but we've known it's existed for a long time, and it could just drop at any point necessarily. But I do think that it's coming out in 2023. The other talking point I've seen coming from this is Square Enix pretty much saying that they have to move into the global market more, because while obviously a lot of their games release worldwide, they do appeal to the Japanese market more, and according to them, it's just not enough. And actually, according to them, it's critical that they move into the global market. And the quote is saying, "For our group to better focus on developing titles for the global market in this changing environment, we need to concentrate our limited resources on the development of strong and robust titles. We need to enhance our presence in the global market by quickly establishing an organizational structure that enables us to consistently roll out high-quality content produced through selective and focused resource allocation, which requires the revamping of our title and studio portfolio." So them talking about essentially wanting to like focus up and put out more quality content kind of takes me back to something I mentioned on this channel where they were just putting out a lot of games. Now, not every game is made by Square Enix. Some of it's just like produced or whatever the case. It's just under the Square Enix umbrella, as we say. And the comparison I made in the past is Bethesda, because that's what happened with Bethesda whenever I was covering them on my channel some years back. Where like BGS, Bethesda Game Studios, they're the ones that actually make the Fallout games, the Elder Scrolls games, and then the upcoming Starfield games, right? But then there's Bethesda Softworks, which kind of produce more or less everything else that you see come out with like the Bethesda name, like Dishonored, Evil Within, Redfall, Deathloop, Doom, all the other stuff that has the Bethesda name these days. They're still made by other studios, but they're produced by Bethesda Softworks. And you kind of see like a similar thing with Square Enix these days, where it feels like a Square Enix game is dropping like every couple of months, right? Even if it's not necessarily being developed by them, they're just constantly shitting out games. And it's like, you got to make some quality games every now and then. It's not to say those games are bad by any means, because I don't play these games. I can't really judge them or anything. But the fact that Square Enix themselves are saying, hey, we need to focus up and make more quality products, I mean, it's got to tell you something about the games that they're releasing. Whether they are good or not, I don't entirely know. Achieving major growth in the game industry is difficult now for companies that compete primarily in the Japanese market, given its graying demographics. As such, it is critical for our business that we produce hit titles that speak to the global market, which offers greater scale in terms of both customers and sales volumes. In other words, the Japanese market is no longer sufficient for achieving a level of earnings that enables us to recoup our development investment and generate a profit. And we therefore need to approach our development efforts based on the assumption that we have to succeed in the global market. Now, to be completely honest, I'm not 100% I know what graying demographic means, if it's like a more business term, as in like some sort of business lingo, or if it's more literal from what I can research and see that it's like graying as in old, as in the demographic of Japan is getting older and it's harder to appeal to, which I think is what it means. But I can't be sure on that. But anyways, the point of all that is, again, they're just talking about wanting to expand into the global market. So essentially the Western market, right? They're in the eastern part of the world, so to speak. They're in Japan. They're trying to appeal to the rest of the world out there. Now, a big part of that's going to be mobile gaming, because mobile gaming is huge in kind of around the world, but specifically in stuff like India and China, where those countries respectively have like over 1 billion people each. And mobile gaming is big there. So if you can get into those markets, it's going to make you a lot of money. And we're going on a bit of a tangent here, but I know specifically when it comes to India, there's a lot of money to be made there. I know this only because of like non-gaming related shit, but I'm a big wrestling fan, and WWE for the last couple of years has been doing shows there. They do them like once or twice a year. There's actually one coming up this next weekend, actually. And I know that when they do these shows, they make literally billions of dollars per show, for one pay-per-view. And we're talking about WWE and professional wrestling. That's nowhere near as big as it was in like the 90s, right? They make a shit ton more money now, but they're not as popular as they used to be. And obviously WWE is not making the kind of money that the gaming market as a whole is making. So obviously there's a shit ton of money to be made there. Which is where you get stuff like First Soldier that has now died, and stuff like Ever Crisis and all of this shit. It's why you've seen so many Square Enix mobile games coming out the last couple of years, because they're trying to tap into that market. And with some games, they're successful, and with others, they're clearly not. And I don't mean specifically like those games coming out in India or China, because I don't know if they get the same games that we get. I know there's a lot of regulations with stuff like China for sure. But in general, that's why you see Square Enix trying to dip into the mobile market. And then the other part of this is them clearly wanting to more or less appeal to the Western market, as we call it, since they're trying to appeal outside of Japan. And chime in if you guys already know what I'm going to say before I say it here. Pause for effect, I guess. Them recently selling off a bunch of their, Western studios. But the big part of that was how much they sold off for such a small amount, right? The grand scheme of things, small amount. $300 million is obviously a lot of goddamn money. But they sold off the Tomb Raider franchise, Deus Ex, and like Legacy of Kain, and a bunch of other shit. And like there's like a backlog of like 50 games or some shit. They sold off an insane amount of shit for $300 million to Embracer. And then now here we are, like 5 to 6 months after that, what kind of went public, or we all knew about that or learned about it or whatever. And they're now like, damn, we sure do need to appeal to the rest of the world outside of Japan. It's like, well, it's almost like you had a bunch of franchises for that, dumbasses. And like, I'm sorry for being so blunt there, but my god, dude, like the Tomb Raider franchise was doing pretty goddamn well. I don't know what all went into like marketing and development costs per game, but all three of like the newer trilogy did just about like 10 million or more in terms of sales. Like, that's insane numbers. You know how many games and franchises and devs would love for their game to hit 10 million plus sales? And a pretty interesting stat that one of the articles that's referencing this annual report pointed out is that the FF7 subgenre of games, as they call it, has sold about 14 million, but I don't know exactly what that's quoting, just because if they're talking about the entire like compilation of games, and when I say compilation, I do include FF7, despite it not being actually technically a part of the compilation. Like when it comes to FF7 original, it's hard to get like an exact number, but according to this website, it sold looks like about 18 million as of now, as of today. So it's obviously more than that 14 million. So like the subgenre thing might be like everything else that isn't FF7 original. So like Crisis Core, Dirge, maybe also Remake, I'd assume. I think it's got to be including Remake, just because I don't think those other like spin-off games like made that much money or sold that much in the grand scheme of things. So even if we were to combine all this together, right? So like around 18 million and around 14 million, you're looking at 32 million units sold between the FF7 franchise as a whole, including FF7 original. But that still has the recent reboot trilogy for Tomb Raider beating the entire Final Fantasy VII video game franchise. On top of that, Embracer Group also pointed out that the franchise as a whole has sold more like 88 million since 1996. And also, according to Embracer, when it came to the mobile market with the Tomb Raider franchise, they had more than 53 million paid downloads. Now, obviously, we're comparing an actual video game franchise to a bunch of spin-off games for one of the numbered entries for FF7, but we're also, at least in this comparison, including the original FF7 as well. At least on paper, the Tomb Raider is so much more successful overall than just FF7, so to me, I don't understand why they sold off Tomb Raider and everything else for such a low amount? Like, is there something we're not aware of? Because I don't understand it. Let's bring up one of the other franchises that were sold, like Legacy of Kain. That's a very popular kind of cult classic franchise, right? There's a bunch of games there that you could remaster, port, remake, whatever, and make you some money. But instead, they sold it off for probably nothing in the grand scheme of things. I gotta imagine, just looking at the numbers here, that like Tomb Raider was a big part of that $300 million. And I don't know what everything else would technically be worth, because man, did Embracer get such a steal. And it's hard for me to look at this like annual report where Square Enix is like, man, we sure do gotta it's critical that we get into the rest of the world. We gotta get outside of Japan and make some games and make some sales. And it's like, y'all just sold off like a fuck ton of franchises. It doesn't make sense. It's laughable. Who's running this company? Especially considering they had a lot of like legacy franchises. Again, Legacy Kain, Tomb Raider, Deus Ex, all that other stuff. These are old franchises that have fan bases, and it's a lot harder to create a new IP and make a new fan base. It's not impossible. We see it all the time, but you also have to then make a good quality product, which according to them, they're not doing, right? They said themselves they got to focus up and make high quality content consistently. Whereas if you take any of these sold off franchises, if you were to do like a brand new game for any of them, it'd probably do better than like a brand new IP, depending on what that new IP would look like. At least in most cases, that would probably be the case. And we've seen them have success with like rebooting franchises, right? Again, using Tomb Raider as an example, that recent reboot trilogy are the best-selling games in all of Tomb Raider. So if they could have just done that with these old IPs, they could have some successful games in the market, right? But no, they just sold it off for a pathetic amount. Anyways, I think that's going to be the video, my dudes. It's a pretty long one, but we haven't uploaded in a couple days, so I kind of wanted to just talk to you guys, I suppose. But what are your thoughts on Square Enix wanting to appeal to the global market, and how can they do that? Because now they're going to have to buy franchises and IPs and studios, which is going to cost a lot of money. And I just don't know if $300 million is enough. But my dude, that is going to be the video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Social networks in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @DashingDavidYT. That's it. Bye.